I'd like to welcome everybody to tonight's tactics class. We've been going through examples from the book, The Art of Chess Combination by the Russian Znosko-Borovsky. He was written, translated into English in 1936, I think. Anyway, he has a lot of good examples. Tonight, we're going to go through unprotected pieces and double attacks. That's going to be our first theme. So that's what you want to look for. Look for the unprotected piece and a way to attack two things, maybe a checkmate and another piece at the same time, a couple pieces, that sort of thing. So this first example, this comes out of the Queen's Indian defense. The characteristic is the black bishop on b7, the fianchetto, and white did the counter fianchetto with his bishop. So the bishops are on the same line, they're opposing each other. Notice that both the white bishop on g2 and the black bishop on b7 are unprotected. Also notice that there are two knights keeping the bishops from attacking each other, a black knight and the white knight. White threatens the black knight, so it looks like black is going to have to play knight takes knight, or black could protect the knight with the move f5. That's played frequently in the Queen's Indian. Black tries to hold on to the e4 square with the bishop, the knight, and maybe either the d5, the d pawn to d5 or the f pawn to f5, and that prevents white from playing pawn e4, which would ordinarily be good for white. So anyway, we'll jump right into this. Black's turn. Like I said, black could avoid the problems we're going to see if he played f5 here. That would block the queen. See how the queen is on that line and is attacking the h7 pawn. And that the white knight can jump to g5, and then the queen and knight will be threatening queen takes pawn checkmate. Of course, white has the slight problem that when he goes knight to g5, there's no black square bishop, so that's the knight's not protected there, and the black queen could just take it. Queen takes knight. But anyway, let's see what happens. Black starts off with knight takes knight. Now, most chess players would probably do queen takes knight here. And it would be approximately an even game. But anyway, the combination is the rather surprising knight up, opening the bishop on g2 to the bishop on b7 and threatening queen takes pawn checkmate. So if black does queen takes knight, then bishop takes bishop, and white wins the rook. He might get his bishop trapped, but he gets the rook worth 5 pawns for the bishop 3 pawns, so white should win that. So black doesn't like that variation. He retreats his knight. So he took a knight on c3, just gives the knight back to trade off some of the attacking pieces. Bishop takes, queen takes. So now this is the double attack I was talking about. The queen threatens queen takes h7 pawn checkmate, and the queen threatens the rook on a8. So the best black can do is take the offending knight, which is unprotected, with the queen. So he gets a knight, which is worth 3 pawns, and he gives up a rook with it, which is worth 5 pawns. And the author, our Russian friend, says that white wins. So at this point, the analysis by the Russian in the book stops, and he declares white has a 1 game. Well, it's convenient. Nowadays, we have these nice computer programs that can analyze things a little deeper, and the computer begs to differ. He says black actually gets good counterplay
c6.
Yes, knight to c6, trapping the queen behind the black pawns. And the queen isn't trapped. The queen can go to b7, but the queen, you notice, can't get back to defend the king's side. And the black knight is hitting that d4 pawn. So now black's going to get a pawn. So he gave up. He got a knight that's 3 pawns. He's going to win a pawn. That's 4 pawns. The rook is 5, so he's only 1 pawn behind, and he has an attacking position. So let's see what happens. Queen has to retreat. So knight takes the pawn. And notice that white can't, he'd love to castle, but that would cost him another pawn with knight takes pawn check. Well, he doesn't want that to happen. So he brings his rook over to d1 to try to drive the knight away. Black just protects it with the c pawn. So that's a very strong knight in the middle of the board on d4. Look at all the squares. It attacks the pawn on e2. If the pawn on e2 moves up, then the knight could go to f3 check, but it is defended by the queen, and the knight can go to c2 check. And if worse comes to worse, the knight can retreat to knight back to f5. Okay, so anyway, let's see what white does. Okay, so white moved his rook up. So the rook defends the e2 pawn, and that will allow white to castle the next move. But black has some more good moves. He plays pawn to queen 4, or d5. Notice that the d5 pawn is protected by the black queens. And now the pawn, black threatens the d5 pawn, takes the c4 pawn, and then he would have a knight and 2 pawns. He'd have 5 pawns for the rook, so that would be an even swap at that point. Let's see what white does. Oh, white decides to take the h7 pawn with the queen. Then he can take the b6 pawn. But now black moves his queen to e5. Again, if white castles, he loses the e2 pawn. Knight takes pawn check. And notice that the e2 pawn is pinned by the queen, so the threat is knight to f3, forking the rook and king with check, which would win for black. So the king has to move over. He has to give up castling. Now the queen comes back and attacks the rook, which is now undefended. White throws up the f4 pawn to break the diagonal of the queen on the rook. Queen drops back to g6. King comes up. Queen comes up, attacking the rook on h1. Now he opens up the center with e5. Okay. White swings the queen over to e7. It prevents the e5 pawn taking the f4 pawn because it would be queen takes queen. That would be the end of black's counterattack. Black retreats the knight to drive the queen away. That'll free up the e5 pawn, takes the f4 pawn. The queen goes to c7, where if black does pawn takes f4 pawn, the queen can take the f4 pawn back. Now, black throws his d-pawn up. Let's see. White moves his rook to f1. Now the black rook gets activated. And this is where we stop. And the computer says this is an even game. White has 2, 4, 6, 7 pawns, 2, 4, 6, 7, 2, 4, 6. Pawns are even. White has an exchange up, but notice that white's pawn structure is busted. Black has the rook and queen coming on the e-file. Anyway, black has good compensation for the exchange. But the main point was that the author, if you go back a number of moves, right here, declared victory for white, but the computer pointed out that it's not clear cut. Of course, they didn't have the computers back then. Okay, let's go to the next example. Again, the theme is double threat, so that's what you want to look for. I remember this one. I keyed it in. But anyway, white to play and win. I'll point out that black's king is under a severe attack. The white rook on h3 is attacking the black pawn on h6. The h6 pawn is defended by the g7 pawn, but notice there's a white bishop on d2 that's also attacking the pawn. So naturally that raises the possibility of bishop takes h6 pawn, g takes bishop, rook takes pawn check, king moves up. If only that bishop on e4 wasn't in the way, we could play queen to g6 check, and the queen and the rook could attack the black king. Now, I will also point out, well, you're supposed to look at the unprotected pieces before we make our decision. What black piece is unprotected? Who in the audience would care to point that out to us? The what? The queen. What square is the queen on? And we happen to have a white light-squared bishop, don't we? So maybe we can do something with that. All right, so those are the elements. Who in the audience would like to say what the winning move is? Go ahead. Bishop what?
Bishop takes h6.
Yeah, let's do that. Pawn takes, now what? How about the rook check first? How about the rook check first? Now we're ready to move our queen to g6 with a strong attack. If the bishop gets out of the way, now we can attack the queen with the bishop. So bishop to b7, and we're attacking the queen and we're threatening queen to g6 check. Oh, that's checkmate, isn't it? So we win the queen and he wins the rook. So black won a bishop and a rook, but we got 2 pawns. Bishop and a rook is 8 points. The queen is 9. 9 and 2 points. We got 11 points and we gave up 8 points. So we're 3 pawns ahead. So that's an easy win. And this is where it stops. So let's run through that just one more time. Bishop takes, rook takes pawn, and then we have the very nice move, bishop attacking the queen, opening up the white queen to g6, which threatens checkmate, so we win the black queen. Okay, let's see who's winning this game. Black has the 2 rooks on e7 and e8, and they're attacking the pawn on e3. So that pawn on e3 is pinned, and black has the pawn on c5, which can take the pawn on d4, and then white can't take it back because he would lose the rook. The rook takes rook check. So again, we didn't check the unprotected piece. That would have given us a clue. The unprotected piece in black's position is the black queen. And so we can sacrifice the rook. That allows us to get our queen with check on line with the black queen. And if the king retreats, he has to go to a black square, and we get knight to g6 check. Obviously, he should have played knight to g5. New variation. Oh, we would still have knight to h5. Yeah, that'll do it. As would, knight to h5, and we win the queen anyway. Very good. Okay, so
What if it moves the king to
here,
F8?
right here.
F8?
Well, we either h8. If we go to f8, it still can be checked by the king, by the knight here. See, the knight checks the king, and then we still have the follow-up queen takes queen. So it didn't matter. The king had to go to a black square, and the knight could attack it on either black square. All right. Well, let's go on. Double threat. Well, white's threatening the knight on e5 with a pawn. Oh, black's on the rook, yeah, with the queen.
What if we do pawn takes knight?
Well, pawn takes knight, then we're on the other knight with the pawn. That looks good. We'd get 2 pieces for the rook, so that's probably it. Let's see.
The rook is defending it on that.
Oh, the other rook is defending it. Good point. So they didn't do pawn takes knight. What's wrong with pawn takes knight? What could possibly be wrong with that move? Pawn takes pawn, and we're on the rook, and if the rook moves, then we get the knight, because we have the knight and the queen on the knight. Excuse me? Knight takes knight. Well, let's take the knight, and we're on the bishop and the rook. So, well, there's no win. Let's see, 2, 4, 5 pawns, 2. Black's actually a pawn up, but I guess.
Well, white has the extra minor.
Pardon?
White has the extra minor piece.
Well, one of those pieces is going. There's a bishop attacked and a rook. Which one do you want to save?
Right.
The rook. So we take the bishop, and then we have bishops of opposite colors. Maybe it'll be a draw. Anyway, that's not the combination, but it was interesting.
Yeah.
The combination is rook here. Rook there. Okay. Well, notice that black's queen is on a white square, and we're in a similar situation. So if black's knight takes the knight on d5, he leaves the h7 pawn unprotected, and the rook can take the h7 pawn, the king takes, and if it weren't for the bishop, we would have queen to h5, check, bishop to h6, queen takes bishop as checkmate. So when the time comes, we take our bishop on e2 and move it to b5 and attack the black queen, similar to that last example. So let's see what happens. Oh, does the bishop move first? And then he gets his checkmate. Well, anyway, let's go on to the next example. We could beat this one to death and not get anywhere. Okay, let's see. I know this one. Black to play and win. It's Reti was white against the world champion Alexander Alekhine, who is black. This combination was actually about 12 moves deep. We're only at the final 4 or 5 moves here. But this is complicated enough. So it's black to play and win. Let's see. Well, knight to c2, that's what I would play. I like to take rooks with knights. So let's see. Okay. Now he does the bishop takes. Well, let's see if rook takes. Well, then we're just an exchange up, right? So he wants to take the rook. Then the knight forks him. So he's going to have to protect that bishop. Now the knight takes with check, and look, we got a nice fork. And the poor rook can't protect the knight because the bishop also covers the b3 square. And Alekhine pulled off another sparkling combination and won the game. What's that?
Show that one more time.
Sure. Okay, so we're in this position. And remember, there were about 5 or 8 moves before this. But anyway, knight takes rook. Bishop takes. You got that? Fork. Rook protects the bishop. Take. And then we get the nice fork, the double attack on the bishop, on the rook and the knight, and the rook can't go to b3 because the bishop covers that square. Okay. Alexander Alekhine, when he was world champion, he was considered the greatest attacking player of his time. I do believe white to play and win. There's an obvious sacrifice here. Who would in the audience would care to say what the obvious sacrifice is for white? Yeah, knight takes e6, pawn takes knight, queen takes pawn, check. Where would you put the king, the black king, after queen takes pawn check? F8? If you go to F8, I can go to D6 check and pick up the rook on C7. How about G7? Oh, I got a check on E7 and I pick up the other rook. I think H8 your only bet. Then it looks like I can still go queen to E7 and I threaten queen takes rook pawn check and queen takes rook check. So let's see what happens. Oh, the queen drops back. That looks like an adequate defense. Who would care to venture the winning move here? The rook takes h7, that's correct. Queen takes knight here. So queen takes knight, queen back, queen takes pawn check, and look at all those pawns. We didn't checkmate him or anything, but we have 3 nice passed pawns, so that wins. Oh, that's okay. Where were we? All right, so we said the obvious knight takes e6, f takes e6, queen takes e6 check. The best move is king in the corner, but then we go to e7, threatening mate and the rook, so the queen has to drop back to protect the rook. But the queen has to protect the h7 pawn and the rook. That's called an overworked defender. You don't want your piece defending 2 critical threats. It just doesn't work out. So rook takes pawn check, diverts the queen from protecting the rook. Now that we're on the other rook, he has to give up the knight. We get that with check. The queen has to block, and then we get the pawn. Now we're 3 pawns up check with a very easy ending. So you got that?
Yep.
Okay. Okie dokie. One more of these double threats. Well, once again, it looks like white wins. You can see the white rook on g3 is on the line with the black king. The bishop on g5, one obvious move is bishop takes h6 pawn, threatening rook takes pawn check. Oh, wait a minute. If the bishop moves, the black queen can take the white queen. So it looks like our bishop is pinned, doesn't it? We do get a nice check, some checks, don't we? What's the winning move?
Queen takes h6.
No. Your friend here was right. The bishop moves up. We sacrifice our queen. And then we get a discovered check. And we can wipe out all black's pieces because we get to repeat this check multiple times. We get the pawn. Now we get the bishop. Now we're going to get that, we're greedy, get that pawn. There are no more things we can take on the 7th rank, so now we have to be satisfied with getting the queen. And we have an easily won ending.
The old windmill.
That was nice. What's that called?
Windmill.
Windmill. The windmill in chess, yeah. Let's see that again. It's kind of pretty. Okay. So it looks like black has everything defended because it looks like we can't move our bishop, but lo and behold, we can because we get the discovered check with the windmill. Queen takes. And now we go to town, just repeating, taking everything on that black second row. Now we don't have any more to take, so we drop back, get the queen, and we have a easily won game. He gets the A2 pawn, but we got 2, 4, 5 pawns. Oh, look, we have an extra piece too. So we have 5 pawns against 3 plus a piece. So we have 3 and 2 pawns. Well, 5 pawns ahead. All right. And plus we can pick up the H6 pawn with bishop to G5. Maybe, maybe not. He would have king to G6 attacking our pieces. But we don't have to be that careful. Okay. That should do it. Thanks for coming.